My daughter-in-law hid my passport so I couldn't travel. Yes, you heard that right. The woman my son married, the woman I welcomed into my home with open arms, the woman I treated like my own blood. She hid my passport so I could not get on that plane. And when I found out what she did, I made sure she never forgot the day she decided to mess with me. Hi, my name is Cornelia. I am 80 years old and I live in a small but beautiful house in Savannah, Georgia, right on the edge of where the old oak trees line the street and the moss hangs low like curtains in the morning light. I lived in this same town for over 50 years. I raised my children here. I buried my husband here, and I built a life here that I am proud of every single day. I wake up and breathe the warm southern air. My house is not big, but it is mine. I painted the front door red myself about 6 years ago, because I read somewhere that a red door means welcome, and I have always wanted my home to feel like a place where people were glad to arrive. I have a porch swing that I sit on every morning with my coffee, watching the birds come to the feeder I keep filled year-round. I have flower boxes under every window, and in the spring they overflow with petunias in every shade of pink and purple you can imagine. My neighbors wave when they walk by. The children on the block know my name, and they know I keep lemon cookies in a tin by the door. I have a kitchen that smells like something good on most days, and a garden that I have been tending for so long it knows my hands. I have a sitting room full of books too, walls high, and a little writing desk by the window where I keep my journal and my bird notebook and my watercolor sketch pad, and on the desk there is always a photograph of Reginald and me on our honeymoon in 1968, young and laughing, and not yet knowing all the ways the world was going to ask things of us. Everything in my house has a story. Everything was chosen or made or given with love. I have built something real here, something rooted, and that rootedness is what gave me the freedom to always come back no matter how far I traveled. Before I retired, I worked as a school librarian for 31 years at the same elementary school, just 3 miles from my house. I loved every single day of that job. I watched children fall in love with books. I helped little ones find stories that made them feel seen, feel heard, feel like they belonged in this world. I had a little corner of the library I called the cozy corner, with beanbag chairs and a soft rug and a lamp that made warm golden light, and I would read aloud to the youngest children on Friday afternoons. Some of those children grew up and came back to tell me that those Friday afternoons were their favorite memory of elementary school. One young man, he must be close to 30 now, he found me at the grocery store about 2 years ago and told me that I had been the first person to hand him a book where someone who looked like him was the hero, and he wanted to thank me. I cried right there in the cereal aisle, and I was not ashamed of it for a single second. That is the kind of work that fills a life. That is the kind of work that makes you feel like you earned your years. I had colleagues who burned out after 10 years, 15 years, who said the budget cuts and the difficult parents and the changing curriculums were too much. I understood that, but I always found my way back to the reason I came, which was a child and a book and the spark that happened when you put the right one in front of the other. I retired 12 years ago when my knees started telling me it was time, and I listened. Since then, I have been living the life I always dreamed of but never had time for when I was working and raising babies and keeping a household together. I started painting watercolors. I was terrible at first, just absolutely terrible. Muddy colors and crooked lines in paintings that looked like a child had sneezed on the paper. But I kept going, 3 mornings a week at the kitchen table with my brushes and my little cups of water. And slowly, something started to come through. My teacher at the community center, a tiny, fierce woman named Gloria who did not believe in false praise, told me one afternoon that I had finally learned to let the water do what it wanted instead of fighting it. I did not fully understand what she meant until I looked at the painting. I'd just finished a loose, soft image of the marsh at golden hour, and I thought, yes, that is it. That is what I was trying to say. I have sold 3 paintings at the local art fair, and I still cannot quite believe it when I think about it. I joined a garden club that meets every second Tuesday, and we talk about soil and mulch and the best varieties of tomatoes for the Georgia heat, and sometimes we just sit on someone's porch and drink sweet tea and laugh until our sides hurt. I took up bird watching, which people laugh at until they try it, and suddenly they cannot stop. I have a pair of binoculars I take everywhere and a little notebook where I record every new bird I spot for the first time. I am up to 217 species now. My most exciting sighting was a painted bunting in my own backyard 3 summers ago, the male in full breeding plumage, so vivid and unreal looking that I stood completely still for 10 minutes, afraid to breathe in case I scared him off. I have friends from garden club and from my painting class and from my neighborhood and from my church, and we take care of each other the way people do when they have lived in the same place long enough to know that community is something you build on purpose, brick by brick, casserole by casserole, phone call by phone call, year by year. I traveled. Oh, how I traveled. Every year, sometimes twice a year, I would pack my little rolling suitcase, tuck my passport into the front pocket of my traveling purse, and I would go somewhere new. I went to Portugal and walked along the cliffs above the Atlantic and at the pastéis de nata still, warm from the bakery oven, and stood in the tiles of old Lisbon and felt the particular beauty of a place that has survived everything. The world threw at it and kept its dignity. I went to Japan and sat in a tea house while the cherry blossoms fell outside the window like pink snow, and a woman in a kimono refilled my cup without saying a word, and the silence felt like a gift. I went to Costa Rica and held a tiny frog in my palm that was the brightest green I had ever seen in my 80 years, and a guide named Marco told me that frog had been on this earth in one form or another for millions of years, and something about that made me feel both very small and very grateful to be alive in the same moment as such a creature. Travel became the thing that kept my heart young even as my bones grew tired. When you travel, you are always a student. You are always the one who does not quite know how things work, and that humility, that willingness to be a beginner, I think it keeps the mind alive in a way that nothing else truly can. My son Ellison, he is a good man. He was always a gentle boy, sensitive, kind, the type who cried at movies and was not embarrassed about it. He would bring home injured birds as a child and nurse them in shoeboxes lined with cotton balls. That was the kind of father Reginald was, and the kind of son Ellison grew up to be. He works in hospital administration now, long hours and stressful work. And he is good at it because he genuinely cares about people. You can see it in the way he talks about his work, even when he is exhausted. He married a woman named Patrice about 7 years ago. Now, I will not stand here and tell you I hated Patrice from the beginning, because that would not be honest. In the beginning, I tried. I genuinely tried to love that woman. I brought food to their house when they first moved in together, big casseroles and pound cakes, and jars of my homemade pepper jelly, because food is how I have always shown love, and I did not know another way to start. I offered to help plan the wedding, and she said she had it handled, which was fine. That was her right, and I respected it. I gave her my mother's pearl earrings as a wedding gift, pearls that had been in my family for 3 generations, pearls my mother had worn to church every Sunday of my childhood, pearls I had planned to give to my own daughter if I had one, and because I did not, I gave them to the woman my son chose to spend his life with, because I wanted her to know that she was family now, real family, the kind that goes back further than she could see. She smiled and said thank you and put them in a box, and I never saw her wear them once in 7 years. Not once. I told myself she was saving them for a special occasion. I told myself many things in those early years because hope is patient, and I am stubborn about it. Over the years, little things started happening. Small things that you notice but tell yourself you are being too sensitive about, that you are reading into, that could have innocent explanations if you are generous enough to look for them. She would make comments about how I called Ellison too often, said it in this light, breezy tone like she was joking, but the message was clear. She would sigh when I came over, a small sound, barely audible, but I heard it every time, and I know she knew I heard it. She would rearrange plans we had made for holidays, and then act like I had gotten the dates wrong when I brought it up, with this patient expression like she was dealing with someone a little confused. And Ellison would get this look on his face where I could see him deciding which of us to believe and hating himself for having to decide. She started controlling who Ellison spent time with and when. His old friends from college stopped coming around. His cousin Marcus, who had been like a brother to him since childhood, told me at a family reunion that he had not seen Ellison in over a year and did not know why his calls were not being returned. And slowly, my son, who used to call me every Sunday without fail, who had called me every Sunday since he left for college because he said Sundays felt wrong without hearing my voice, Started calling maybe once a month, and sometimes less than that. I would see a month go by and I would be the one calling him. And he would answer, but there was always something, careful and slightly distant in his voice, like he was talking to me with one ear turned toward a room I could not see into. I never said anything, I kept my peace. My own mother always told me that in matters of your children's marriages, you hold your tongue unless someone is being hurt, because no good ever came from a mother-in-law who could not keep quiet. So I kept quiet, I watched, and I kept quiet, and I loved my son from whatever distance his wife needed me to maintain. I told myself that marriages are private countries with their own rules and customs, and that an outsider who tries to walk in without an invitation only ever causes more harm than the harm they were trying to fix. I told myself that Ellison was a grown man who could see what was happening and make his own choices, but there were nights when I sat on my porch swing after dark and looked at the phone in my hand and felt a loneliness so heavy it surprised me, a loneliness that had nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with being kept away from my own child by someone who had smiled at me at the altar and taken my mother's pearls. Then last spring I planned a trip to Greece. This had been on my list for 20 years. My late husband, Reginald, God rest his soul, had always promised we would go together someday. He had a photograph torn from a magazine pinned above his desk for years. The white buildings of Santorini, cascading down a cliff above water so blue it almost hurt to look at it. He said, "Cornelia, one day we are going to stand right there together." And I believed him because Reginald was a man who kept his promises when life allowed him to. But life did not always allow. There were the years when the children were small and money was tight. There were the years when his mother was ill and needed us nearby. There were the years when we told ourselves there was still time, still next year, still soon. And then one February morning, Reginald went to the doctor for a routine checkup and came home with a diagnosis that rearranged every plan we had ever made. And 8 months later, he was gone. I held his hand at the end, and I told him we would have gone to Greece. And he smiled at me with his eyes before they closed for the last time. Going to Greece felt like carrying a piece of him with me, like finishing something we had started together even though I would be finishing it alone. I booked the trip for 3 weeks. I planned to spend a week in Athens walking through history I had read about all my life. A week on Santorini watching the sunsets Reginald had kept in that photograph for so many years, and a final week on a smaller island that my friend from Garden Club had told me was quieter and more real and more beautiful than any postcard. I bought a new dress for the trip, pale blue like the Aegean Sea I had seen in pictures for decades. I told my friends at Garden Club and they cheered for me. I told my neighbor Rosalie and she came over with a bottle of wine to celebrate. I could barely sleep for weeks, lying awake in the good way, the way where your mind is full of beautiful things you are moving toward. 2 weeks before I was supposed to leave, I was visiting Ellison and Patrice for dinner. It had been a pleasant enough evening on the surface, the kind of evening where everyone is careful and polite and no one says anything true. I had left my travel bag in their guest room the week before when I had stayed over to help with some repairs around their house, a leaking faucet and some trim work that Ellison never quite found the time for, and I had stayed 2 nights cooking and making myself useful the way I always did when I came. My passport was in that travel bag. I had put it there weeks earlier so I would not forget it when packing time came, tucked in the front pocket where it always lived on travel days. I did not think twice about it. I had left things at their house before and always found them exactly where I had left them. It was family. The night before my flight, I went to get my passport out of my travel bag. It was not there. I searched every pocket, every compartment, every corner of that bag, 3 times with the overhead light on and then once more with a flashlight in case something had slipped into a lining seam somewhere. Nothing. I turned my entire house upside down thinking maybe I had taken it out at some point and forgotten. The way you sometimes move something to a safe place and then cannot recall what you decided was safe. I checked every drawer in my bedroom. I checked the filing cabinet in the study. I checked the kitchen junk drawer even though I knew in my heart it made no sense. I checked the coat closet and the bathroom cabinet and the shelf above the washing machine. I could not find it anywhere. I was frantic in a way I am not accustomed to being, because I am generally an organized woman, a woman who knows where things are, and the not knowing had a particular terror to it, that a younger version of me might not have understood. but I understood completely. I barely slept that night, lying in the dark, running through every possibility, convinced by turns that I had lost my own mind and that something else entirely was wrong, but not yet knowing what. I missed my flight. I sat in my house in Savannah, Georgia, in the pale blue dress I had bought for Greece, with my packed suitcase standing by the front door, and I cried. Not delicate, quiet tears, but the ugly kind that come from somewhere below words and below reason. I cried for the trip. I cried for Reginald and the photograph above his desk and the promise we never got to keep together. I cried because I had been so excited, the kind of excitement that is also a kind of hope, and now the excitement had curdled into something heavy and bewildering inside my chest. I cried until I was empty, and then I sat very still and looked at my suitcase and the morning light coming through the windows, and I told myself that I would find the passport, that I would rebook, that this was a setback and not an ending. I made myself believe it, even though something in me felt like the world had done something mean and unnecessary to a woman who had already had enough taken from her. I reported the passport missing and applied for a replacement. A few weeks went by. I tried to stay busy with my garden and my painting and my birds. I started looking into rebooking the Greece trip, but my heart was not quite in it yet. The way it is sometimes hard to want something again after it has been taken from you, and you do not yet understand why. And then one afternoon in early summer, my grandson Tobias came by. Tobias is Ellison's boy from a relationship before Patrice, 17 years old, tall and quiet and thoughtful in a way that reminds me so much of his father at that age that sometimes it catches me off guard when he turns his head a certain way in the light. He and I have always been close in the particular way that sometimes exists between grandparents and grandchildren, a closeness that skips the middle generation and lands somewhere warm and uncomplicated and true. He comes by on Saturdays to help me with the heavier garden work, turning the compost and moving bags of mulch, and in return, I feed him because a teenage boy is always hungry, and I have always believed in feeding people. He showed up that afternoon without me asking, the way he sometimes did when something was weighing on him and he needed to be somewhere comfortable while he decided what to do with it. We worked in the garden for a while without much talking, which was fine, because Tobias and I had always been comfortable in silence together. We did not need to fill every moment with words. But he was quieter than usual, and I noticed it. I noticed the way he pulled weeds without making his usual comments about the birds. Noticed the way he did not ask me any of his regular questions about what I was reading or where I was planning to travel next. After a while, I could feel something sitting on him, some weight he was deciding whether to put down. Then, without looking up from the ground, he said, "Grandma, I have to tell you something, and I need you not to get upset with me because I did not know what to do, and I have been carrying this for weeks and it has been eating at me." I put down my gardening gloves. I looked at him directly. I said, "Baby, you can tell me anything, and I mean that down to the bottom of my bones. And whatever it is, you are not in any trouble with me. Do you hear me?" He took a long breath. He said he had been in the guest room at his father's house about a month ago looking for a phone charger he kept in there. He had opened the nightstand drawer because that was where he usually left it. And there in the drawer was my passport. He recognized it because he had seen it before when I was showing him photographs from a previous trip. He said he stood there for a moment, not understanding what he was seeing, the way your mind takes a second to catch up to something that should not exist. And then he saw the sticky note tucked inside the front cover, in Patrice's handwriting. That said, "Do not mention to Cornelia." I sat very still for a long time after Tobias told me that. The garden went quiet around me, or maybe I just stopped hearing it. I looked at the petunias in the flower boxes and the bird feeder and the red front door of my house, and I breathed, very slowly and carefully, and let my mind do what it needed to do with the information I had just received. I thanked Tobias in a voice that I kept steady because he did not need to carry my emotions on top of his own. I told him clearly that he had done absolutely the right thing and that I was proud of him and not upset with him for a single second of a single minute. I told him I loved him and that he was a good person with a good conscience, and that was not nothing. That was everything. I sent him home with a pound cake and a large jar of the pepper jelly he liked. And then I went inside and sat at my kitchen table alone, with a cup of tea that went cold beside Me and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do next. Not for 10 minutes, for most of the afternoon. I sat with it and I turned it over. And I looked at it from every angle because I was not going to act in anger and I was not going to act in haste. I was going to act with intention and with clarity and with the full weight of 80 years behind me. I did not scream. I did not call Ellison in a rage that evening. I did not get in my car and drive to their house with my heart pounding, because I am 80 years old and I have lived long enough to know that how you respond to a wrong matters just as much as the wrong itself. The person who stays steady when they have every right to fall apart tends to be the person whose words carry the most weight when the time finally comes to speak them. I wanted to be clear. I wanted to be steady. I wanted there to be absolutely no confusion about what had happened and what it meant and what I was prepared to do about it. I sat with my cold tea and my thoughts, and by the time evening came, I knew exactly what my next steps were going to be. I called a lawyer first thing the next morning. My friend Odessa's son Franklin is a family attorney with his own practice, and I had known Franklin since he was 8 years old and used to come into my library on Saturday mornings and take out books about dinosaurs and space, shuttles, and anything else with pictures that showed him how enormous and interesting the world was. I called him and I explained the situation in plain factual terms. No emotion, just the facts in order. And I asked him directly whether withholding someone's government identification document was a legal thing to do. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Miss Cornelia, it is not." He told me it could constitute interference with travel rights and potentially unlawful retention of identity documents depending on intent and the specific circumstances. He told me that a written note demonstrating deliberate intent, like the one Tobias had photographed, was meaningful evidence. He said if I wanted to pursue any formal action, I had a reasonable case and he would help me put it together. I thanked him and told him I would be in touch, and I meant every word of it. Then I called my son. I kept my voice completely even and warm the way I always do, because I did not want him on guard before I arrived. I did not accuse. I did not give him any indication of what was coming. I simply said, "Ellison, I need to come over tomorrow morning and sit down with you and Patrice together." He said, "Of course, Mama, is everything all right?" I said, "Everything will be fine. I just need us all to be in the same room." He said, "Of course." He did not push further, but I think some part of him, the part that had grown up watching me and knew what a quiet voice from me could sometimes mean, already sensed that something was coming that could not be turned back. I dressed very carefully the next morning. I took my time with it, in a way I do not always do for ordinary days, because this was not an ordinary day. I wore my good lavender dress with the small covered buttons. I wore my pearl necklace, the one that matched the earrings I had given to Patrice on her wedding day, the ones she had placed in a box and never opened again. I did my hair the way I used to when I had somewhere important to be, set and smooth. I put on my good shoes and I checked myself in the mirror and I looked like exactly what I was. A woman who had built a life with her own hands and her own will. A woman who had earned every gray hair and every year. A woman who deserved to be treated with basic human respect and who was not going to pretend otherwise to spare anyone's feelings. I sat down at their kitchen table. Patrice was already seated across from me with her arms crossed before I had even settled into my chair, which told me she had some sense that this was not an ordinary visit. Ellison sat at the head of the table between us with his hands folded and his jaw tight, a man who loved 2 women and was about to watch something happen that he had not caused and could not stop. I placed 3 things on the table in front of me. The notes from my conversation with Franklin written out clearly on good note paper. A printed copy of the photograph Tobias had taken of my passport, lying in that nightstand drawer with the sticky note visible inside the front cover, because my grandson had the presence of mind and the good conscience to photograph it before he closed the drawer. And I thanked God for raising that boy the way I did. And my original flight booking confirmation showing the departure date, the date I had sat in my blue dress in this same city and sobbed. I looked at Patrice and I said, "I am going to give you one opportunity to explain this to me and to your husband before I decide what the next step is." My voice did not waver. The color left her face very fast. She looked at the photograph on the table, and she looked at me, and she looked at Ellison, and I watched her run through her options. She started with excuses, which I had expected. She said she had found the passport on the floor of the guest room and had put it somewhere safe because she was concerned it would be misplaced, and she had simply forgotten to let me know. She kept her voice calm, but I could see her hands on the tabletop were not calm. I let her talk all the way through without interrupting her once. When she finished, I looked at her evenly and I said, "The sticky note in your handwriting says, 'Do not mention to Cornelia.' That is not the note of a woman who found something and forgot. That is the note of a woman who made a decision on purpose and wanted to maintain it. Those are two entirely different things, and I believe you know that, and I believe Ellison, sitting right here beside you, can see that too." I watched Ellison read the photograph again. I watched him read his wife's handwriting on that small piece of paper. I watched 7 years of small things he had explained away or minimized, all of them rearranging in front of him into a shape he could not pretend was something else. His face changed in a way that was difficult to look at, and I looked at it anyway because that is what a mother does. He said, "Patrice, that is my mother's passport. She missed her trip." She started to cry. She said she had not thought it would matter so much, that she had only wanted some time without the pull in different directions, that she had not meant any real harm by it. I sat with those words. I turned them over carefully, and then I set them down because I felt nothing about those tears. Not cruelty, not coldness, just a clear, settled nothing. Because I have lived 80 years, and I know the difference between tears of remorse and tears of a person who has been caught, and these were the second kind. I told them both, in the same level voice I had maintained since the moment I sat down, that I would not be filing anything with Franklin's office at this time, not because what had been done was acceptable, but because Ellison is my son, and I did not come into this world to make my son's life harder than it had to be. But I told Patrice with complete and direct clarity that whatever her feelings about me were, whatever discomfort or need for control had brought her to that decision, she would never again touch my life, my travel, my documents, my independence, my money, my relationships, or my connection to my son and my grandson. I told her that the next time anything like this occurred, I would not be sitting at a kitchen table. I told her that Franklin had my file. I stood up. I smoothed my lavender dress. I picked up my papers and placed them in my handbag. I looked at Ellison, and I told him I loved him and that I hoped he would take time to think honestly about the patterns he had been living inside and whether those were patterns he had actually chosen. And then I walked out, down the front steps, got into my car, and sat for just a moment before I turned the key, breathing slowly, looking at the oak trees lining their street. Something had settled in my chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. I drove home to my red door and my flower boxes and my porch swing and my birds. 3 months later, I went to Greece. I rebooked the exact same itinerary because I was not going to let fear or anger or anyone else's choices change what I had planned. I packed the pale blue dress. I carried my new passport in the front pocket of my traveling purse where it has always lived. I flew to Athens and I walked the ancient stones of the Acropolis in the early morning before the crowds came, when the light was pure gold and the city spread out quiet and white below, and I felt like I was standing at the very edge of time. I ate at a small restaurant down a narrow side street where the owner brought me extra bread because she said I reminded her of her own mother, and I thanked her in the 3 words of Greek I had practiced on the long flight over. I took a ferry to Santorini and found a room with a blue door and a view of the caldera, and I sat on the small whitewashed terrace the first evening with a cold glass of local wine, and I watched the sun go down over the water, and I let myself feel all of it, the beauty and the grief and the gratitude all at once. I wore the blue dress. I stood on the cliffs where the white buildings cascade down toward the sea, exactly the place from the photograph that had hung above Reginald's desk for all those years, and I whispered his name into the wind coming up from the water. I said, "I made it, Reg. I told you one of us would." I took a photograph of myself, standing there with the sea behind, me and the sky going every shade of pink and gold and apricot, and I am smiling in that photograph in a way that comes from somewhere deep and certain and settled. That photograph is framed now and hanging on my living room wall, and I look at it every single morning when I come downstairs, and it reminds me that life keeps offering beautiful things to the people who refuse to stop reaching for them. Patrice and Ellison are in counseling now. I think that is the right thing, and I have kept my opinions about it mostly to myself because it is their marriage and their work to do, not mine. Allison calls me every Sunday again. He has not missed a single Sunday since that morning in the kitchen, and I count that as one of the great gifts of the past several months. We talk about my birds and his week and what I am painting and what books I have been reading, and sometimes we talk about nothing in particular for 20 minutes, and that nothing in particular is one of the sweetest sounds I know. We do not discuss that morning at the kitchen table very often. There is not much need to. But one Sunday evening he called, and after we had talked for a while, he went quiet. And then he said, "Mama, I am sorry it took me so long to see what was happening right in front of me." I could hear what it cost him to say it. I told him I loved him. I told him that was more than enough for me, and I meant it. Because I have never needed my children to be perfect, only to find their way back when they have drifted, and he had found his way back. I am 80 years old. I have outlasted things that were supposed to break me. I have buried a husband who was my best friend for 42 years. I have raised children and watched them grow into people. I have read 10,000 books and fed lunch to a generation of children and driven my neighbors to their appointments when they could not drive themselves, and baked pound cakes for every grief and every celebration that came within reach of my kitchen. I have stood on cliffs above 3 different oceans and whispered names into the wind. I have 217 birds in my little notebook and a painting of the marsh at golden hour hanging in a stranger's living room, and a red front door that means welcome, and a porch swing where I drink my coffee every morning, and a grandson who knows right from wrong and loves me enough to tell me the truth even when the truth is heavy to carry. No one, not a daughter-in-law, not anyone on this earth gets to put walls around a life like that. And if someone tries, you take your time. You put on your best dress. You call your lawyer and you book your flight. Now tell me where you are watching from and drop your city down in the comments below. And if you love your grandma, if you have a woman in your life who raised you up and deserves every good thing this world has to give her, hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a story, and share this with your friends because some stories need to be heard.